Good morning, everyone. My name is Vicki Davis. I'm a classroom teacher from the United States, from Camilla, Georgia. If you can't tell by my accent, I will say hello, y'all. That's what we say where I'm from. Today we have a very important topic that I'm passionate about. How many of you went to the Global Teacher Prize last night? Did anyone cry like I did? Okay, it was so moving because our teaching profession, for us to move education forward, we have to move the teaching profession forward. And how is that going to happen? What are we going to do to move it forward? So today we have sort of a TED Talk approach. Each of our incredible speakers will speak for 12 minutes. Then we'll have a question. I'll ask the first one, and then we'll try to take at least two from the audience. So if you have a question when they conclude, kind of signal, and I'll make sure that you get included with that question. So we're going to talk today about the latest challenging research on teaching and also some of the questions that we have. Our first presenter has such an important topic. Mr. Brett Wigdortz has led the Teach First program as its CEO since its launch. He wrote the business plan for the charity while working as a management consultant at McKinsey & Company, and took a leave of absence in February 2002 to develop the idea. He's also worked as a journalist and a researcher. I'm amazed by the website. I spent some time there this morning, and their goal is to kind of break the cycle or the link of low socioeconomic background and poor educational attainment. And he wants to break that link, particularly in the United Kingdom where he's working. He does have a book, Success Against the Odds. So Brett, we'll have you share with us your vision of the future. Deprivation doesn't have to equal destiny.
Thanks, Vicki. Okay, so it's great to be here. First of all, I was wondering if there's any Teach First people in the room who have done Teach First. Usually there's one or two. No? Oh, okay. A bunch of our people are here. I can't believe they're not coming. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a bit about what Teach First is and sort of the five values that we think are important to close the gap and why deprivation doesn't have to equal destiny. So what do future teachers, what is the future of the teaching profession? What do future teachers need? At Teach First, we have 5 values, and we operate very closely according to these 5 values. And our belief is that all teachers, our community that we work with, of our teachers, other teachers we're working with, we want them to work within these values. And I'm going to talk a bit about each one of the 5. The 5 values we think are important for teaching are the value of commitment, the value of excellence, the value of leadership, the value of collaboration, and the value of integrity. So I'm going to talk about each one of those 5, and then I'll answer some questions. So start the value of commitment. We started Teach First about 13 years ago. When we started, at that point, we couldn't find any schools, in London at least, that had a majority of kids from low-income communities, but the school was doing better than the national average. So there were very, very few, if any, examples of truly outstanding schools in low-income communities. And I think there were a lot of people who even believed that wasn't possible. And at the time, one of the things we were looking for was to see what are the things that could help turn this around, to help close the gaps in the lowest income schools. And when you looked at the most successful classrooms, the most successful departments, it was always obviously about the teaching in that classroom, the leadership in the department, or the leadership in the school. And we started the charity Teach First to try to get additional talent into these schools, and our theory of change is to create additional leadership into the system to close these gaps. Our vision is that no child's educational success is limited by their socioeconomic background. In order to ensure that that's a future that becomes a reality, it requires the commitment of lots and lots and lots and lots of people. It requires the commitment of classroom leaders, people we're recruiting. It requires the commitment of lots of their colleagues, teachers from all other routes in. It requires the commitment of business. It requires the commitment of government. It requires the commitment of parents, of children. It requires a societal commitment. And what we've seen around the world is it's only in places where that commitment is really firmly established are these gaps closed. So the way we operate is to achieve that vision is we want to build this community of exceptional leaders who have that commitment. We'll create that change or help create that change within the classroom, schools, and across society. This year, we're recruiting about 1,800 teachers to start. which makes us the largest graduate recruiter in the country, and also makes us about 1/3 of all new teachers nationally in low-income schools, about 10% of all teachers nationally in all schools. And what's exciting is places like Oxford, Cambridge, lots of other top universities, we're now the biggest graduate recruiter. And what it shows is there's lots and lots of great talent, new graduates. We also get a lot of mid-career professionals who are changing careers, who have that commitment and want to make this change happen. And more we look at it, the more you realize there's lots of people who want to see this change happen. The second slide I look at is the value of excellence. Excellence is really important in order to close this gap. This is the gap in test results in England between children on free school meals, those of low income, and children not on free school meals. And you can see that gap has been reducing slightly, which is good news, but it still exists in a major way. And the way we would describe this gap is twofold. One, England is a country where people at least claim the culture is around fair play. It's a culture of fair play. And I just show this to anyone and say, look, this isn't fair, right? On one level, on a human level, it's not fair. It's not fair that some children, depending on their background, aren't getting the education they need to be successful. It's a personal tragedy for that young person. It's a tragedy for that child's family. And that's just not fair for anyone. If you want to look at it at a macro level, it's not fair for society, because the cost of actually having people in the 21st century who are leaving the education system unprepared for jobs and careers that will be existing in the coming decades, that's not fair for UK PLC, as you'd say. It holds the country back, and it means that there's just going to be people who are going to have to be, aren't going to be able to make the most not only of themselves, but also to support each other. So that's not fair. And the way to change that is through excellence. To have that excellence belief that all children can succeed at the top level, they could all get excellent results. I'll talk in a bit, we've seen that in schools, we've seen that in areas of the country, and we know that children from all backgrounds can achieve at that same level. There's no reason there needs to be a gap in those lines. And as long as you start with that belief of excellence in every single child, then that will take you quite far as a teacher in the next few decades. The third value is, I would say, if anything, one of the most core values of Teach First. I think all 5 are core, but in the end, Teach First, we're about leadership. And I would say leadership is an absolute core value that every teacher needs to show going forwards. To me, a leader is someone who gets people to go to the place where they need to get to when they themselves don't know they need to get there, or they themselves don't know how to get there. A great teacher is a leader, a classroom leader, leading young people, helping young people get to the place they need to go to. It's not someone who is a passive professional, but actually an active leader in the classroom. All children need active classroom leaders, they need department leaders, they need school leaders, and in the system there needs to be system leaders who are helping make this change possible. The core area of Teach First is we recruit people who we think have great leadership skills. We think every teacher in the country should be a great leader. There's great leaders coming into the profession from all different routes, and that's very important. The core part of Teach First is we look for that leadership, and then the whole program, we call it our Leadership Development Program. As part of the Leadership Development Program, our teachers get qualified. They get a postgraduate certificate of education in partnership with 12 excellent schools of education across the country. We work with great leadership trainers from the military, from business, from schools of education, academia, internationally, to work to ensure our teachers are great classroom leaders, have the pedagogy to successfully lead their children, but also have that leadership mindset they need to be successful. The fourth value is one of collaboration. Collaboration is crucial for any classroom leader, for any teacher, for anyone who wants to make change happen in anywhere, I would say. It's absolutely vital to be a great teacher. Everyone knows the best teachers are those who share and learn from each other, and who are actually part of a collaborative system. When you look around the world, something that strikes me, I've been lucky to go to schools in probably about 20 countries. The best systems are always those systems focused on collaboration. Recently, my team went to Ontario to see what was happening there, and you see a real collaboration-focused system. In Shanghai, also where I was, you see the system is very focused on collaboration and people working together. The best schools are schools with open doors, where teachers are constantly collaborating and learning from each other. With us, what we did, why the slide's up there, in 2012, we collaborated with about 2,000 teachers, hundreds of head teachers, lots of charities and businesses and policymakers to develop these 5 impact goals. 5 gaps we see that exist in the UK that we want to see changed by 2022. Now, these gaps aren't going to disappear through Teach First work, but they are going to disappear if all of society is collaborating together to make these disappear. And as part of this, we launched the Fair Education Alliance a few months ago, about a year ago now, made up of about 40 charities, teacher unions, other representatives, who are all working together to close these gaps. And we just think that's absolutely crucial. You know, everyone agrees children's education is crucially important. Everyone agrees that children from low-income backgrounds should succeed at the highest level. Everyone agrees on that. We all just need to collaborate better together and work together to make this change happen. And the final value I'll talk about is integrity. I think, like any profession, to be a great teacher, you need to show integrity. And part of integrity is constantly improvement. The best teachers, like the best leaders anywhere, are people who are constantly looking to improve and to get better, are constantly learning. You know, something that's interesting is only recently, I think, at least in England, are more and more teachers beginning to use research. I think it's exciting that I'm seeing all over the country research beginning to really filter through in a way that at least I didn't see it in previous years. And there is actually more and more great research, great data on what makes a successful classroom, what makes a successful school. You know, this quote from Professor Dylan William at the Institute of Education, you know, there are classrooms that have closed the gaps. There are cities. London is now the highest performing city in England, probably the highest performing city in Europe. The gap between low income and high income kids in England has shrunk markedly. What can the rest of England learn from London? What can other cities in Europe maybe learn from London? There's schools in London where actually the gap has shrunk to 0, basically, between free school meal kids and non-free school meal kids. What can other schools learn from that? What can we learn from the best departments, from the best teaching? Just like medicine, which people use as an example, or other fields, the more we can actually use integrity to learn from each other and actually see what works in different places, the more successful children will be, and the more chance there is that they'll get the fair deal that they need. So there's the 5 values, I think, to be an important teacher. Commitment to a strong value for education, a focus on excellence to stop the gap at any point before it starts. Leadership, that there needs to be a leadership gap that needs to be closed in classrooms, departments, schools, and across society and systems. Collaboration, how to work with others. And the value of integrity, constantly listening, learning, and using data and evidence base correctly. Thank you.
So Brett, one of the big questions, we've been asked to have solutions. And one of the big questions is that the way teachers are paid very often impacts what those teachers do in the classroom. So there's a movement in many places to pay for performance, which, you know, it sounds great. I actually have a background in business, and I had salespeople, and I paid them for every cell phone that they sold. And it made sense in that scenario. But one thing, you showed a chart of the difference between the test scores of those that are more impoverished and those that are not. And very often it's found that when we pay for performance, that the best teachers start going to the more affluent schools so they can make more money. So how can we hold teachers accountable without impacting the poorest children who need those opportunities?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So first of all, what we found at Teach First, I mean, we don't pay our teachers differently than any other teacher. My background, I used to be a management consultant and did work on the war for talent. And what you find, organizations that attract and keep the best talent, the best way they do it is through things like great professional development opportunities, really good training, being part of a common ethos, good leadership, you know, all of those things. So the first thing I'd say is salary is an easy lever to look at, but actually it's much less useful actually to keep and really excite great talent than lots of other levers. And I really would think schools and systems should focus on, you know, CPD, on some of these other levers to keep great talent. What I think is, you know, England has moved to a lot of autonomy in schools, where head teachers have more and more autonomy. And to me, it seems, for the most part, head teachers running their schools in a good way, you know, and then the head teachers having, like any leader of any organization, having that autonomy to pay people at different scales, you know, depending on what they need for that school, would seem to make sense to me.
And there's a great book out that a lot of us are reading called Multiplier, and there are those who multiply, and there are those who diminish. There's 2 kinds of leaders, and we definitely, teachers need to work for multipliers. Now, do we have any questions from the audience for Brett? Would anybody like to have a question? Okay, we have 2 questions. This lady and this lady. Let's grab your the roving microphone. Stand up and how are we doing? I have a timer. How are we doing on our question time? Okay, good. We have time for 2. Go ahead. Please stand up and introduce yourself and where you're from and share your question.
Hello. Okay, it works. Farah Williamson from Plan International. I just wanted to say congratulations on Teach First because it's definitely changed the way graduates look at entering education. I was wondering if you had any plans to take the model, take it elsewhere. There's been a lot of talk about how teachers want to be helping in developing countries from the developed world. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so first of all, about 7 years ago, we were approached by entrepreneurs in some other countries who wanted to start similar programs in those countries. I think you might have been one of them, next to me. And so about 7 years ago, we co-founded with Wendy Kopp, who's also here. The two of us co-founded Teach for All, which is this network of independent programs around the world starting similar programs. So what's been exciting there is when we started, we thought mostly these programs would be in more developed countries, but actually starting with Teach for India and more around the world, you see a lot of less developed countries or developing countries starting these programs where they're getting the best talent in those countries focused in the classroom. And what you see all over the world, people really want to do these leadership opportunities. Just recently I was in Bangladesh, and I've been in Nepal and Malaysia, recently Philippines, and these are some countries where they're getting the top leaders in those countries, these amazing graduates or other professionals, to work in low-income schools and become these leaders. So as much as possible, what we're focusing on is getting the local leadership in each country focused on it, rather than sending British people to other countries.
Excellent. One more question. Got a lady back here in the back. Please stand up, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Lisa Barbarino. I'm a teacher trainer for Abu Dhabi Education, government schools, and I really like the collaboration. I think it's key, but Brett, could you give us an idea of what that looks like? Our biggest hurdle is time, how to give teachers time to collaborate. And if we can find that time, what does it really look like to you in the schools where you have seen that it's really successful?
Yeah, so collaboration. The thing is, I think it has to be done in a way where it actually buys time for people. If people collaborate well, then suddenly they could find they have lots of extra time. So, on a very basic level, how many teachers come out with new lesson plans all the time when there's really great lesson plans out there, and if they could just collaborate in different ways. On another level, all of our teachers, we want to make sure that as part of their training during the 2 years, they see truly outstanding classrooms in low-income communities. And what strikes us is many of them are in schools where none of the teachers there have ever actually seen outstanding teaching in low-income communities, or outstanding teaching at all, really. So there's lots of other teachers in the school who are great, but because they've never actually seen outstanding teaching, they sort of think what they're doing is outstanding, and once they actually see some outstanding teaching, they can improve a lot, but they're sort of stuck because they don't know what else is out there. So, what we've seen a lot of examples is when you actually show people what is outstanding, when you actually give them, lots of support in that way, people can take advantage of it and work a lot smarter and a lot quicker, and, it can actually save people time because they could operate at a much better level.
A great idea. I love it, the sending teachers to good classrooms.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll bring the mic up to the front. And just one thing to point out, a thought-provoking thought for all of you. We have to move on to our next speaker, but I've often wondered why administrators are the only ones doing peer reviews of teachers. Because you have an opportunity when you watch a teacher of learning about teaching. It's such an opportunity to start having peer reviewers watch teachers, other peers watch each other, because I learn something every time I'm in another teacher's classroom. Our next speaker is Miss Ramya I practiced so hard. Venkataraman. She is founder and CEO of the Center for Teacher Accreditation, or CENTA. It has a purpose of empowering teachers by recognizing outstanding teachers and creating opportunities for them in their schools through a high-quality certification service. Prior to this, Ramya was with McKinsey for 15 plus years and leader of McKinsey's education practice in India. And she's also recently received the Global Entrepreneurship Award from McKinsey and continues to be an advisor for them. Now, her expertise is driving large-scale education reform in emerging markets. So today she's going to be talking about teacher certification and what that needs to look like in the next 10 years.
So there's an N missing at the end of my Twitter ID over there for anyone who's interested. But that's fine. It's Ramya V. Raman. So as Wendy said, a lot of my conversation is going to be in the context of emerging markets, which is where majority of my work has been and which is what I'm familiar with. So are my slides there?
Yes, Vic, go ahead.
Okay. So over the last few decades, many emerging markets like India have been on a journey with somewhat similar patterns. Is that better? Yeah. So, so as I said, many of the emerging markets have been on a journey with somewhat similar patterns over the last few decades, typically starting with, let us build schools across the length and breadth of the country, and over time, systems start reporting 90% plus access, 95%, 98%, and everyone is happy. Till the question of enrollment comes up. So are we getting enough children into schools? What about girl children? What about minorities? And that led to the enrollment drives. And again, systems started reporting 90% plus enrollment, 95%, 98%, and in some places we even have 105 and 110%. Don't ask me how, that's a separate story. But before we come to the topic for today, and before we, sorry, the clicker is not, yeah, okay. So before we come to the topic for today and talk about all the things that need to be improved, I just want us to pause for a minute and remember the government leaders, the civil society leaders, the philanthropists, the private sector leaders who helped in making these levels of access and enrollment happen. These are big achievements in these large, complex, resource-constrained environments. Now, over the last 10 years or so, most of these emerging markets like India have been on another journey, which has again started with a question, the question of quality. Many studies started showing that that there are several gaps in the quality of learning in student outcomes, like the Assad report by Pratham. And this is probably the part of the journey that most of us in this room have been part of. And for many of us who have been working passionately with these systems, or at least speaking for myself, interestingly, we've had personal journeys that have been somewhat analogous to or have mirrored the journeys that the systems have gone through. And most of us realized as a first step in these personal journeys that unlike access and enrollment, quality is not directly proportional to resources and effort. This is a McKinsey study from 2010 where we looked at a large number of school systems around the world and found that Kuwait and Singapore, for example, spend more or less the same per student PPP adjusted and have widely varying levels of performance on something like PISA. So not being able to just pump in resources and get it done makes quality a much tougher problem to solve. The first step of this journey for most systems has typically been direct-to-student initiatives. So content, books, online content, devices, after-school centers, tutoring, coaching for various specific exams. In some cases, services that are sold to schools or through schools like smart boards, but still, in a sense, direct-to-student. And for many of us who've probably been involved with such efforts, we would have noticed that these efforts allow us to have greater control on quality or greater control on the outcome. So, for example, being involved with Akanksha Foundation in India, I was amazed to find that the program could actually take a child from a very underprivileged background all the way to the level where she's capable of appearing for India's toughest MBA entrance. And even today, in most of our emerging markets, and for that matter, in many developed markets, the majority of activity in education services is direct to student. Why? Simply because direct to student is intuitive. Most of us have been students. Most of us relate to these products and services. It leads to high control over impact, as I said. And equally, if not more importantly, especially for private for-profit companies, this is where the revenue lies. Most parents and students are willing to pay because of the tangible benefit that they see. At the same time, people started asking the next question, which is, given that the child spends majority of his time in the main classroom, is it really possible to change the quality of an education system without impacting the main classroom? The answer was obviously no. And for impacting the main classroom, it became clear to many of us that the teacher is the most central element. And you can see from this very famous US-based study the difference in impact between being with a low-performing versus a high-performing teacher for a continuous 3-year period. And research and experience also showed that for teacher quality, teacher professional development, both upfront professional development and ongoing professional development is crucial. And that led to what I call the step 3 of the journey in many of our emerging markets, which is the launch of a whole lot of teacher professional development programs. So non-profits started running these programs, private companies started running these programs, governments allocated budgets, built organizations. For example, we worked with the city of Mumbai, the city government of Mumbai, and helped build a cadre of high-quality coaches who were selected through a rigorous process, trained through a unique public-private partnership, and who played intense day-to-day roles in the school and the classroom. And this was probably the most impactful and important part of the broader school system reform that we were driving then. And many of us would have seen such important, such innovative, impactful teacher development programs. But if you look at the broader landscape of teacher professional development, it's a very small percentage of programs that actually have quality outcomes. It's a very small percentage that get to any scale, a very small percentage that are sustainable, and naturally a much, much smaller percentage that do all three. And that leads us to the natural question, why? Why is it that when all of us realize that teacher quality is critical for the quality of education and teacher professional development is critical for the teacher, why is it that teacher professional development has not really scaled up and sustained in most of our emerging markets? There are probably many reasons for that, and we don't know all the reasons. But one of the reasons that that is myself and my colleagues at the Center for Teacher Accreditation, believe in a lot, is that by and large, no one has the incentive to do this. There is no incentive, economic incentive for the individual teacher to get trained in most of our systems. The average school is unwilling to spend on teacher development because it's not visible or tangible. And this is not a cost that the school can just pass on to parents. So if you listen to what the CEO of a leading teacher training entity had to say, it is just very difficult to run a sustainable teacher training entity when you're dependent on a few progressive schools, on donor grants, and on government payments. So net-net, teacher professional development in emerging markets, the way I see it is huge need, very little demand. So no wonder we don't really have high-quality, large-scale entities doing this. And I'll repeat that, huge need, very little demand. And this brings me to the idea that I want to present in this Ideaslab, which is the idea of teacher certification. The minute you say teacher certification, I think most people in education sort of switch off, and maybe I've already lost most of you in this room by saying that. But let's give this a minute, because the way we define this, or the way we need to define this in emerging markets, is probably very different from the way it has been defined in developed systems. So if you look at this ETS study, which captures a number of developed education systems, you find that there are well-defined teacher evaluation points at different stages of the teacher's career, and some of them, the darker ones, the black-colored ones, are high stakes. That is, they have some consequences. So net-net, teacher certification in a developed system is essentially a well-defined evaluation leading to a well-defined consequence. On the other hand, when we try to redefine this in an emerging market context, and this is the idea that is driving the Center for Teacher Accreditation, or CENTA, we find that three critical elements need to come together. And I'm just going to make sure I get these right by literally reading them out. The first one is quality standards. So quality standards that a large number of stakeholders in the ecosystem see as relevant. What are the competencies that we would look for from teachers at different stages of their career? And this needs to be a combination of technical competencies in teaching, core competencies and mindsets related to them as individuals, and professional competencies related to them in their school environments. And over time, these need to be refined based on empirical evidence about the correlation with actual classroom effectiveness. But this, of course, is part of any high-quality certification. The second element, which is where the redefinition really comes in a big way, is opportunities. Unlike developed systems where some of these opportunities might be well-defined in the system itself, or unlike certain other professions where big opportunities may automatically exist, in this case, we need to create the opportunities. So schools need to come together to recruit teachers based on certification. Foundations need to come together to provide professional development opportunities. Supplemental income needs to be created through certain networks and so on. And in addition to all this, we also need to look at immediate tactical opportunities, such as linking the certification to prizes, hard cash, media recognition, so on. The third part, the third element of this ecosystem is professional development, which is aligned with all this, and for which demand gets created now because of the teacher becoming a pulling customer. And all this together, hopefully creating an increasingly predictive and valuable certificate. I realize that we've run out of time, so let me just end by saying that while this could mean a lot for teachers, for schools, for teacher trainers, for donors, investors, and we can come back to this if people have questions, I want to leave with one thought, which is a call to action for stakeholders. This ecosystem can come together only by all relevant stakeholders being part of it, and that's schools and governments recruiting, promoting based on certification, universities, experts helping make the certification predictive, teacher support organizations aligning the support to what is most needed, and foundations helping establish the first virtuous cycle, after which it can hopefully take on a life of its own. So sorry for exceeding time a bit, and thank you very much.
So Ramya, as you have a seat, you have an interesting approach in your certification. I do encourage you to look at it online. It is a very different approach, somewhat of a market-based certification approach. But your approach, you really want teachers to identify their strengths. We've come to grips with the fact that every child is different. And if you look at the teachers that we saw yesterday, we have dancing teachers. I don't think dancing you could put in a script. How can we help our profession understand that student engagement starts with teacher engagement and really bringing teacher strengths to the forefront? So how does your certification take into account the strengths of the individual teacher?
No, that's a question that, as you can imagine, comes up very often. And over the last year or so, as we have worked with a number of stakeholders, the answer that we have sort of come to, and we'll have to see how this plays out, is that there are certain parameters that are hygiene and that all teachers may need to fulfill. And at the same time, teachers can have spikes in specific areas. So there can be a teacher who's really great at creativity, a teacher who's really great at rigor, a teacher who's great at connect with children, etc. And what our certificate will do is not only say that you have got the certificate, but that this is your specific spike or a couple of spikes. And therefore, for schools looking for those spikes, they can decide that this is where we want to pitch our recruiting. And interestingly, if you look at our logo, the first letter C and the multicolors of that are sort of intended to indicate exactly that every teacher has a unique set of strengths, and we don't want this to be standardized entirely through certification.
Which is great as we move. We're no longer in the industrial age, so it would make sense that our certification needs to evolve and bring out the strengths of every teacher. I think that's particularly fascinating and very progressive. Questions from the audience. We probably have, how many minutes do we have left? Okay, we have time for one question. So right here in the middle. We do have the Twitter handles of our guests up here, so you can also tweet the questions to the guests directly.
Yeah, do add an N at the end of mine.
The name is Johnny Harb. I'm working in teacher training. I find that the biggest challenge is certification, because any certification is as good as the legal system that is supporting it and the recognition that is gaining across borders. So in your experience and from your certification, where does it take us? Does it cross borders?
Does it? What is the last?
Cross borders?
So we have actually very consciously adopted the model of what we see as a market-driven certificate rather than a regulatory certificate, and that has been a very conscious choice, mainly because ultimately a certificate is just as good as what employers think it is and what employers are willing to give to it in terms of value. And very often, regulatory certificates, with all due respect, tend to deteriorate over time simply because they can grow with the mandate rather than have to get the quality really right for the market. So we've decided to be a market-driven certificate, in which case the border doesn't matter. It can be offered to any system. And as long as there is an anchor group of schools that is saying, yes, we will recruit and promote using this certificate, and there's a group of training providers saying, yes, we can train to these standards, it can work in literally every system.
Excellent. There's a lot of questions, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to answer your question. And please, again, try to tweet if you're on Twitter, tweet your question to those that are here. Our next speaker is Ms. Karina Wong. She is currently the Deputy Director at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She has spearheaded the Foundation's investments in a set of teacher-designed literacy and math tools, and has led efforts to redesign professional development systems with an eye towards creating real-time opportunities for teachers to collaborate. And I do want to point out that yesterday in the OECD information, we found that collaborative professional learning is a very important part of what we all need to be doing. That's something that we can all do. Her current portfolio is focused on building strong national and local teacher practice networks and finding ways to connect teachers to other teachers at scale. She believes nobody knows teaching like teachers, and the greatest innovations over the next decade in education will come from the classroom teacher. You are speaking my language. Karina. Thanks, Vicki.
Thanks, Vicki. It's really a pleasure to be here. You heard Brett talk a little bit about quality teaching programs and what it takes to be a quality teacher. You heard Ramya talk a little bit about how to certify and why it's important, and I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I'm going to argue that none of that matters unless we change the profession itself, and argue that that's going to come from within. It's just a pleasure to be here. You know where I work, and most people just want to know what it's like to work with Bill Gates, but let me tell you a little bit what I do. It may surprise you that I don't give away computers. A lot of people think that we actually give away computers. And it may surprise you that we actually don't invest directly in education internationally. Most of our education investments are actually in the United States. So people often wonder then, what do I do? My mother even gets confused. She says, you work in education, but you're not a teacher. You work for Bill Gates, but you don't give away computers. What do you really do? So instead of confusing you with all that, let me start by telling you what I care about and who I am. I'm actually a fifth-generation Chinese American. My great-great-great-great-grandparents immigrated to California in the 1830s. I'm one of 6 children. There are a couple cousins in there, so you might count 8. And I'm a middle child, and my mother I consider the original Tiger Mom. For those of you who know that book, Amy Chua, the Yale professor who wrote Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom, my mother actually told me she's not really Chinese, and she doesn't really understand what it's like to be a Tiger Mom. So like most Tiger Moms, she told me, don't become a teacher. She even encouraged me to become a fashion designer over becoming a teacher. Eventually, it took me 6, it might have taken me 8 years because I was working full-time. I became a teacher and got my credential, actually out of George Washington University. I taught in a variety of ways, but most of them unusual, and this is one of them. I lived in South Africa for 2.5 years with the Peace Corps. But let me tell you really why teachers matter most to me. First of all, it's undisputable. My colleague showed you a chart with how important teachers are. It's undisputable. Teachers have the most impact on student success. Second, I'm a working mother with 3 children. Their teachers spend more time with my children during the waking hours than I do. Think about that. They actually do. And finally, teachers change lives the way doctors and firefighters save lives. This is a picture of my daughter just during the Chinese New Year celebration that we just celebrated this February, and her preschool teacher. Her preschool teacher's name is Florence. Florence speaks Chinese. She was born in Taiwan, and when my daughter was 3, she taught her a Chinese song. And because I'm a 5th-generation Californian, I speak Spanish. I don't speak Chinese, and my parents never spoke Chinese to me. But it ignited a curiosity in my daughter. For the next 6 years, she wanted to learn Chinese. I had to send her to a special school to do that. And this last year, 2 years ago, we took her to Chengdu for a science camp program. And she was one of very few American students that actually could communicate to the other Chinese students in Chinese. At the end of the program, she stood up in front of 150 parents and kids, and 10 minutes before was asked to do a live translation for 6 other American students who couldn't speak Chinese and describe what their experience was like for their first time in China. And I watched my daughter on a camera with a microphone in her hand do that live translation, and someone after said, aren't you proud of your daughter? And I said, I'm extremely proud. I have no idea what she said. And someone said, well, let me just tell you, she only made one mistake in her live translation. She translated, they were studying about crickets, crickets as insect instead of actually using the proper word for cricket. That's because of her teacher. I know you're here because a teacher probably influenced you in that way. And when the education minister asked me to close my eyes, I imagined my children's teachers, the teachers of the future that are going to build the next set of leaders in this country. So what's going to change it all? I'm going to argue that it's actually not a lot of external factors that are going on in the United States. Many of you may have heard of the Common Core. It's a big deal in the United States. It may not seem like such a big deal to those of you in Europe and Asia, but it's a really big milestone for the United States. Some of you may have heard of the research that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has done around effective teaching. How do we measure what an effective teacher is? That research didn't exist 3 or 4 years ago. And as some of you who attended the technology session yesterday may have heard, there's just an explosion of educational technology in the United States. These are a few of some really interesting ones. But what I want to argue is that the change in the profession is going to come from the community itself. It must come from the community itself if we're really, truly going to design the profession. We have to move away from just thinking about systems and structures and tools and that's what I call an education reform mindset. Things are done to teachers, or teachers are asked to do things in the name of policies and systems. And put on what I call a group genius mindset, which is to put teachers at the center of this work. Not even to say it's user-centered design, but to have teachers as the designers in redesigning the profession. I think there's 3 social forces and ways that we can all be part of group genius and make this happen. This is a network analysis map from a professor at Michigan State. His name is Ken Frank. It may be hard for you to see, but there's one teacher, it's teacher number 2, and there's a teacher that's teacher 20. Teacher 2 is the teacher that was actually trained to implement the reforms. Teacher 20, though, is the teacher that had the strongest number of networks and the highest impact. You know this teacher in your schools and in your buildings. It's not always the instructional leader. It's the teacher that is the most influential that really matters most when you're trying to shift the profession. So the question becomes, how do we find teacher 20? But we live in a digital age. This is a map from LinkedIn. And influence looks very different. I've never met Amy, but if I were an English teacher, I certainly would want to meet a woman who's got 20-some thousand Twitter followers. She's a high school English teacher. This is a picture of Mino Ramo. She's an aspiring influencer who's coming to the Gates Foundation this next year as a teaching fellow, who has 6,000 Twitter followers. She has an incredible blog and a Twitter opportunity that she calls EngChat that she does. It's hashtag ENGCHAT every week. And she's written a book about what it takes to reinvigorate teaching. Those are the kind of influencers that are going to redesign the profession. They belong to multiple networks, and we need to figure out how to expand those networks. So that brings me to my second social force that I think matters, and that is actually the power of networks. This is Ryan Jones. He's a teacher that I hadn't met but just a year ago, and he belongs to a network called the New Teacher Center. The New Teacher Center supports and mentors new teachers in their first 5 years of growth. He was introduced to something called the Literacy Design Collaborative, which was one of the very first investments I made at the Gates Foundation. And he started using those tools in his classroom. He started seeing his kids write in incredible ways. Other teachers started noticing, they saying, "What are you doing in your classroom that's so different?" His principal started to notice. Before he knew it, he was training the entire school in the Literacy Design Collaborative template task. And this last year, he sent me an email and saying, "You won't believe it, I've been invited to the district to give a presentation on the Literacy Design Collaborative materials and train the entire district in these materials." That's the power of a single teacher, and that's the power of a network that brought him the support and equipped him with the kinds of tools that he needed to be effective. But the fact is, we've done a lot of research. Teaching is isolating. Teachers can close their doors, but they actually want to collaborate. They want to find the time. They want to share their resources, their experience, and their expertise. And they actually trust other teachers. We really do believe at the foundation that nobody knows teaching like teachers. So the question then becomes, how do we actually support teachers in sharing their experience, their expertise? Our research has shown that while the majority of teachers are on Facebook, they don't like to use it for professional purposes. LinkedIn is a professional website, but no teachers are really on it. They like to go to Pinterest, but they can't have the conversations and share their experiences the way that you can through blogs like Humans of New York. So that really brings me to my sort of third element of the social force that I think is going to help redesign the teaching profession. And that really is the power of narratives. The stories that teachers tell. Not their experience, as in their number of experiences they teach, but in the experiences they have that unite them as teachers across the country. Only teachers have those experiences, and they all have those experiences. And the question is, how do we begin to really help teachers express those experiences and share those narratives? We did some research in the last year on sort of what are the dominant narratives, and we looked at the online discourse, over 10,000 Twitter feeds and blog posts, and said, what are the dominant narratives that teachers actually have? And there are actually 10 that emerged. This is one from Sandra. I'll just read you the quote. "If I hear one more time you get your summers off, I invite anyone who says how easy our job is to come into my classroom for half a day." Is that exhaustion, or is that about teachers deserving professional respect? One of the other dominant narratives that we saw came from a teacher, Lori. "We lose a lot of good young teachers because they don't see any way to advance except out of the classroom." Is that frustration, or is that about teachers needing a career pathway? I think that we need to create a new narrative with teachers, teachers themselves need to create this narrative. And it might look a little bit like this. This is a teacher from one of our teacher leader communities. We call it ESET 2, Elevating and Celebrating Effective Teachers in Teaching. Her name is Joanne. She says, "I'm part of a network of educators who are passionate and at the top of their game. We create the space where change can happen." I think that's a pretty powerful narrative. And the question is, how can we ramp up that narrative in ways that it really lifts up the profession rather than the political narratives that seem to dominate in the newspapers? At the end of the day, I think it's pretty simple. It's not really that complicated. It's about putting teachers at the center of redesign. It's about letting them take the change and be the change, because I think that's why they came into teaching in the first place. We all need to put on this group genius mindset. If we help redesign the teaching profession, if we're to redesign the teaching profession. So I end with this sort of thought that if we don't really pay attention to their narratives, their connections through networks, and leverage teachers as influencers, we might really just miss the most radical idea, and that is that change is going to come from the community itself. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I am big into Twitter. Those of you who are on Twitter, I tweeted Cool Cat Teacher, and that's a big part of my PLN. My friend Tom Whitby's in the back. He runs the largest Twitter chat in the world, EdChat. He and his friend Steve Anderson are here. But right now, Karina, you really hit on something important, and that is the personal learning network. That's what we call it as teachers. And right now I'm writing a professional development course to be approved in the state of Georgia, and I had written that I wanted the teachers to have 15 minutes that they spent 2 to 3 times a week checking their Twitter feed and then reflecting and implementing in the classroom. And I was told by some of the accrediting people that approve professional development that it was easier to approve seat time, and that it would be impossible to approve something like checking Twitter in your PLN, so that I'm very limited in how we can write that course, that you literally almost take it to lecture. So what can we do in a world where we have professional development that requires what we call cheeks in the seats in US, instead of the collaboration that we know works?
Yeah. I want to go back to the slide that Andrea showed on the very first day. Some of you may have seen it. And he asked a question that I thought was really profound. I think too often today we're asking sort of how well do you teach, or how effective are you? And he put a different question on the table. He said, how great do you hope you can be? And I think that's the kind of question that will really change the mindset around accreditation. The question I'd add to that is sort of what community supports you. And can you imagine that if, when teachers were going for job interviews, that was the kind of question that the leadership in districts and schools were asking teachers? I think there's a lot of hope, Vicki, and some folks call it micro-credentialing. You see it, while I don't think LinkedIn is probably the place where teachers are ever going to go in any deep and meaningful way, you do see little tags for different experiences, and I think and skill sets and strengths. I think in the future what we're going to see is there'll be ways to capture those kinds of things, and they might be smaller than you're a 4th grade teacher and you teach English. They might have very different ways of capturing, you know, maybe you're just actually you're a 6th grade teacher, but you really only teach math, and the sets of skills that you can show are certified either through your network or through some micro-credentialing are a much smaller subset of skills, so that we have to really expand what we think about what we certify, how we certify it, and what we think teachers do in the classroom.
Excellent. We have time for 2 questions, and then we'll open up the floor for questions for our entire panel. Here you go. We have a question in the back. Stephen Anderson. Well, everybody wants to hear you. There we go.
Stephen Anderson, I'm an education consultant in the United States.
I don't think we can hear you. I think we need the other mic.
It's on now, I think.
There we go.
I could do another.
Okay, there we go. This is much better.
Stephen Anderson, I'm an education consultant in the United States. As Vicki mentioned, Tom and I run the largest education Twitter chat in the world, EdChat. And I think it's important that, you know, Tom and I recently wrote a book about the power that connections can have in the teaching space. Yet the battle that we face is with leadership. That teachers have a great, as we mentioned, have a great desire to utilize social networks, to be connected with other educators, to go and visit other classrooms, to have opportunities to sit and visit with other teachers. Yet leadership is telling them that stuff's not relevant, that stuff can't happen in the classroom, that stuff isn't going to help us meet Common Core or help us take a PARCC test or help us improve our achievement. Yet if you ask any teacher who's been involved in social media for any length of time, they will tell you it's the greatest investment in time they have ever taken when it comes to their own professional learning. So how is it that we can, Tom and I, we battle and can push teachers into using social networking all the time, but we get so much resistance from principals, from superintendents, and especially in the US, from states that say, none of that matters because it's not actually, we can't measure that. We can't measure the impact that has in the classroom. Yet teachers will tell you it has tremendous impact in the classroom.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All I can say is keep the fight. I'm totally with you. At the foundation, we're large, and we have this incredible luxury that we can say both and often. And so the kind of work that you're describing and the kind of work that I've been investing in is part of the answer, but I think we also need sort of some of the systemic reforms. And, I think the problem that we have, I was actually talking to Brett's colleague, Wendy Kopp, on the way in here, and she was telling me about the reforms in Ontario and how refreshing it was to see the professional culture there. And I made a comment to her that I feel one of the problems in the United States in particular is we have this high demand system as opposed to a high demand and a high support system. And I think it's when we get to thinking more about high support that it can change the minds of leadership. But I hear you, it's an uphill battle. And I think that's why the foundation is committed to both supporting sort of the organic and informal connections and networks, as well as driving hard at systemic change.
Okay. One more question for Karina. We'll have one. It's right there. Stand up and introduce yourself, please.
Hi,
We hear you.
you do?
Yes, we do.
Hello, my name is Afonso, and I teach project-based learning in the economics and management context for undergrads. Having been...
Oh, we don't. I thought we did. The front audience is in front is telling me we can't hear.
well, sorry again.
Better, thank you.
Hi, my name is Afonso, and I use project-based learning in high schools as a social entrepreneur, but I also do this at university for management economics students. Being exposed to teaching, observing others also to learn from my own use, I wonder one challenge that I see in Portugal, and I'd like to see your opinions on it. What effective solutions have you found on lifelong learning for teachers? Because teaching is changing all the time, and it's a very long career, and I'm sure it's very challenging to be reinventing yourself the whole time, and especially many times it works in public systems that are very strict. So what best practice have you identified in lifelong learning for teachers in your experience? Thank you.
There's a couple of things. I'm reminded of the comment that someone made about collaboration, and one of the investments I made was in reinventing professional development, and one of the first things that we tried to get at was how do you find that time for teachers to collaborate? And one of the teachers, I have her quote stuck in my mind, she said, we've been asking this forever. I'm a veteran teacher, and I've finally gotten off the treadmill. I was going to quit next year. But we found them one full day a week for professional development, and it really shifted her own mindset and opened it up to new opportunities. So I think that's an important part of lifelong learning, is actually letting teachers get off the treadmill and finding that time, whatever it takes. The second thing I'm reminded of is a quote from a teacher who had never written a blog, who'd been at that conference I had mentioned, ESET 2, and she wrote a blog recently on Medium, and she talked about isolation and how she really wanted to find a network. And I think there's power in those networks to encourage lifelong learning. And the fact is that teachers want to be part of something bigger than the political stuff that happens in their districts. And they want to know that even when that reform goes away, they don't have to say this too shall pass, because they're part of a much bigger movement. And I think that's really the power of the influencers like Vicki and some of the others of you that are in the room, and Stephen, is that you help teachers be part of a bigger community, and that in and of itself is actually supporting their lifelong learning.
Excellent. Now, we're going to turn to all of you panelists. Everyone came today expecting to hear research about the future of teaching. So I'd like each of you just to think of something you've read recently or recent research that has impacted how you're working with teachers and the future of teaching as you think that it will be. If you remember the author, that's fine. If not, then if you'll share it on your Twitter feed later. Go ahead. Who wants to start?
So influencing how teachers are teaching. I mean, you know, I know all of our teachers at Teach First love Doug Lemov's work, which people are probably aware of. That's actually, you know, looking at some of the best teaching in the US, and he's been in Britain recently, and looking actually at what's going on in the best classrooms, actually dissecting it. And I think, I mean, what our team would say is there's just actually a lot of really good data now on what is good teaching. And you know, he's one. There's a lot of British professors. Dylan Williams was one who I quoted from before, who I think also has some really good data on what is good teaching actually, and what works and what doesn't work. And also, the third example I'll give in England, there's this educational endowment fund which was launched about 3 years ago with a £150 million endowment that it's spending down over 15 years, and it's using controlled. What's it called? Controlled assessment. It's actually doing interventions and then actually figuring out what the impact is of those interventions actually in some really gold-plated studies. And they've come out with a lot of data. And where we are now at Teach First is we're trying to figure out how do we help our teacher, like there's tons of data now out there on what is great teaching. The problem is teachers aren't using it for the most part because it doesn't feel accessible enough, or you know, the schools don't really know enough about it. So with us, the big problem that we're seeing now is how do you get all this great data and knowledge and bring it down where teachers can use it day to day. That's the big issue, I think.
Excellent. Ramya?
So actually, we found that there is a lot of research out there, as you said, on what good teaching looks like. We also found that there is a lot of research out there on what good teaching professional development looks like. What we did not find easily is, coming back to what I said, how do you create demand from teachers for that professional development? And actually, there isn't enough research on that as we've looked around. And we find that most of the research in this comes from systems, much more developed systems where that system automatically exists, that at the entry point of teaching, there is an evaluation you need to go through that can lead to certain professional development, et cetera, But how can a market-driven demand creation mechanism work? There isn't enough research. So we are actually hoping that through so we are sort of, I would say, taking a punt on it and going with the hypothesis that this is likely to work. We have seen it in certain other professions, including in India and in other parts of the world. And we are hoping that in the next few years, through field experience, we'll probably have some research on what can create demand for teacher professional development, which is the primary question that we are trying to answer.
That's excellent. I would like to add that we have to get to, as a profession, I'm a teacher, this intrinsic desire that I control my classroom and I want to improve my classroom. I think that's why I have so many followers on Twitter, is because I believe that I'm the only one who can change my classroom. That's my job. That's what I do. And that teachers need to be empowered and know that they can make a difference in their classroom. And that's part of it. And then they do demand. But how do we get there? You're so right that there are many places that don't pay for it. It becomes a matter of money, finances. It's a challenge to get the kind of PD we need.
Yeah, and Vicki, if I may add, we want that demand coming not only from sort of outstanding teachers like yourself, but from the average teacher. And I think that's really the problem we are trying to solve. The outstanding teacher will automatically ask for professional development, but how do you get the average teacher to ask for professional development just like the average doctor or the average IT professional might ask for it, because there is a career pathway associated with it.
And the average will become exceptional through the professional development, and that's which is the goal. Karina, research.
Yeah, so I'll tell you the last 3 books I read. One was The Alliance. It's by Reid Hoffman, and it's all about sort of talent management in a digital age. And I think it's an interesting adjacency. If teachers were treated the way he treats employees, what kind of profession we might have. The book I'm currently reading is by a behavioral economist. His name is Dan Ariely, and I don't even remember the name of it. It's something about rational irrationality. But it's an interesting book because it's all about behavior change and what it takes, why we do the things we do, and how sometimes they're irrational. And he tries to explain it, and I think it's important as we think about sort of changing the teaching profession. Teachers are people. We're all people, and this is a social change, and we actually have to think about what it'll take to change behavior. So I'm just at the beginning of that, not sure what the implications are. And the last one is actually an education book. It's called Strategic Inquiry, and it was written by Joan Talbot, a professor at Stanford and a colleague from New York, and it's one of the best short reads around around sort of how do you create a professional learning community and the protocols that that community should have to really make changes in their classroom. It's a terrific read, and I think it's a powerful little book.
Excellent. And I'm a big Karina Wong fan. I'm going to add mine. We know that classroom management is the #1 indicator for an excellent classroom. I mean, you look at most of the research, it's going to show classroom management up there. And he wrote a great book called The First Days of School, and it is on classroom management. And I just can't stress enough how important that is. Now, do we have one question for all three of our panelists to conclude? We have one hand raised very high in the back. Stand up and introduce yourself, please.
Good morning. I'm Margaret Atack, Chief Education Officer for GEMS. This is a question for Brett. Brett, your scheme, the Teach First, you're graduating a very small percentage of very bright young graduates who then enter the classroom. But for the majority, the content is still controlled by the institutes of education. What do you think that they can learn from your approach?
Yeah, I mean, so first I'd say is all of our teachers, we also do partner with schools of education, and they're integrated into our training. And this year we are going to be about 1/10 of all newly qualified teachers in the UK in the state system. So we're getting to be a large percentage of it. What's been exciting to me over the last 10 or 12 years is I think lots of schools of education in Great Britain are changing the way that they're training teachers. And what I've seen is a lot of other schools of education are focused a lot more on things like a strong ethos in teaching, which I thought maybe was lacking when we started. Sort of a focus on building a cohort. That's something which I'm seeing other schools of education are doing more and more, which I think is really important. You know, even a few years ago, the teacher qualification standards in England changed about 4 years ago, and I was on the committee that wrote the new standards. And what was exciting to me is the new standards are very explicit, that they have some very new explicit things in them. So to be a qualified teacher in England now, you need to show that you can work with children from all different sorts of backgrounds, and I think that's important. You need, I think the very first standard is around closing the gaps, and actually to show that you're a good qualified teacher, you need to be able to show that you could raise standards from children from low-income backgrounds, more disadvantaged backgrounds. So these are all things which 10 years ago I think weren't core part of the education system in England. And I think it's really exciting seeing that happening throughout the country.
Excellent. One more question? Yes. Right here. At the front here in the purple tie. I think I saw him first. Blue tie, I'm probably not seeing very well. A little jet lag here.
I just bought it, so.
Go ahead.
I was expecting some appreciation. My question to the panel is, I'm a teacher educator, and in my country, in Pakistan, I've trained and developed more than 9,500 teachers. I work with public sector, I work with private sector, I work with organizations such as Microsoft. My question is, I get confused. I travel to the World Economic Forum, I come here, I go around the world, we keep hearing that the teachers and the learners, there's a difference between digital immigrants and digital natives and digital citizens. We all know that the teachers have evolved into technology. Now, my question is that at a time when we are promoting digital literacy, teachers as technologists, at a time when we are trying to promote collaboration, networking, integration, and we try to scale teaching and learning ideas. And then we complain that the teaching as a profession, it lacks compassion, empathy, social and emotional connection, cognitive skills. How do you feel that the future of teaching is going to be one which will be dominated by technology, but will also promote passion, compassion, and empathy in the classroom?
And we actually just have, we're out of time, so does one of you want to hit that question? Who feels passionately about it? Go ahead. Ramya, you feel passionate? Go ahead.
So what I have at least seen on the ground is that there are certain aspects of the teaching profession that lend themselves better to standardization, process, technology. And there are certain aspects of the teaching profession that need to be retained by the individual. So for example, a high quality lesson plan is something that you can absolutely develop for how do you teach fraction in class 4 and share it using technology. On the other hand, if there is a particular child in the classroom who's facing a particular problem, what is the empathetic response as a teacher? That's not something that technology is going to solve. So those who are sort of working in teacher professional development and on processes and technologies around this probably need to start making that separation and start figuring out which part can be taken outside the classroom. Technology is only one part of it. It could be process, it could be coaches, but which part can be taken outside the classroom and which part needs to be retained in the classroom. That's at least how I would think about it.
And, you know, as a teacher, it's important. You can't really eat a computer. So if they're hungry, you've got a personal issue you have to deal with before you can do anything else. So I hope you'll all be encouraged that students matter and teachers matter. Thank you for coming today. I hope you have a great conference. And thank you to our panelists.